Chapter 13. Nora's Grandchildren. One afternoon, Eric and Ivra started out for the Forest Children's Moss Village to play with them, but when they got there, they found all the little houses deserted. Not a forest child was to be found. They must have gone into some other part of the forest to play. So Ivra and Eric wandered on and on, a little lonely, a little tired of just each other for comrades, till at last they came to the very edge of the forest, and there was Nora's farm, a rambling red brick house, with a barn twice its size behind it. Down in the pasture by the house, half a dozen snow witches were dancing in a circle, now near, now far, all over the pasture, and sometimes right up to the farmhouse windows. Ivra clapped her hands and bounded forward. Eric did not follow, he stood to watch. When the snow witches saw Ivra running to them, they rushed to meet her. For a minute she was lost in a cloud of blown snow, and then there she was dancing in their circle, back and forth across the pasture, and then away, away, away. But before she frolicked quite out of sight, she turned to look for her playfellow, and beckoned to him. "Come on," she called, "we're going to slide on the brook, below the cornfield." But Eric did not follow. He did not like the snow witches, and just as Ivra and the witches drifted out of sight, he thought he heard the forest children laughing. The sound came from the barn, so Eric ran to the door. It was a big sliding door, and now stood open a crack, just large enough for a child to slip through. Eric went in. The barn was tremendously big, a great dusty place full of the smell of hay. Ahead of him were two stalls, with a horse in one, but Eric was most interested in the empty stall, for it was from there the laughter seemed to come. He stood looking and listening, and then right down through the ceiling of the stall shot a child, and landed laughing and squealing in the hay in the manger. She sat up, saw Eric, and stared. She was a little girl about his own age, freckled-faced, snub-nosed, and red-haired. She had the jolliest, the nicest face in the world. Eric opened his mouth to say hello, but kept it open, silent in amazement, for another child had shot through the ceiling and landed beside the girl. This was a boy. He was red-headed too, freckle-faced and snub-nosed. He looked even jollier than the girl. Before Eric had closed his mouth on his amazement, whoop, and down came another boy. This boy was red-haired, freckled-faced, and snub-nosed, and he looked jollier than the other two put together, if that were possible, for his red hair curled in saucy tight little ringlets, and his mouth was wide with smiles. It was this last one who said, "Hello, who are you?" "Eric, who are you?" "Nora's grandchildren, of course. Come up, we are having sport." The three children ran across the barn to a ladder and scrambled up and disappeared through a trap door at the top. Eric followed. The attic was full of hay in mountains and little hills, hay and hay and hay. He followed the children around the biggest mountain, through a tunnel, and there they vanished. He found the hole in the stable ceiling and looked down. Not very far below him was the manger full of hay and red-headed children. "Look out down there!" "Whoop!" cried Eric, and dropped, landing among them. Then the four laughed heartily together and ran across the barn again. up the ladder, around the hay mountain, and dropped down the hole. They did that dozens of times until they were tired of it. Then they played hide-and-go-seek in the hay country, and after that blind man's buff in the barn below. The little girl was blind man first. They tied a red handkerchief tight around her eyes. Then they ran about, dodging her, calling her, laughing at her groping hands and hesitating steps. But after a few minutes she became accustomed to the darkness, and ran and jumped about after them until they had to be very weary and swift indeed. Soon she caught Eric, and then he was blind man. By and by they played tag, just plain tag, and Eric liked that best of all. Back and forth across the great room they raced, up the ladder, over the hay, through the hole into the stable, round and round, in and out, up and down, until they were too tired and hot for any more. Then they lay up in the hay, where there was a little window, looking far out across the meadows. Eric saw Ivra out there in the first field, wandering alone, and now and then looking up at the barn. She must have heard their shouts and laughter. He pointed her out to the other children. "That is my playmate out there," he said. "Let's open the window and call to her to come up. She'll tell us stories." The children looked out eagerly. "But there's nobody there," they said. Eric laughed. "No, look," he pointed with his finger. "Over there by the white birch. Look, she sees us," he waved. "Quick, help me open the window." He could not find the catch. The window was draped with cobwebs and dust, with the dust of years. It looked as though it had never been opened. The little red-headed girl put her hand on his arm. She was laughing. "Don't be silly," she said. "There's no one by the white birch. You're imagining." "Why, look, of course she's there." Eric was impatient. "She's moving now, waving to us. Of course you see her." "Yes," said the jolliest of the boys. "We do see it faintly. We've seen it before, too. A kind of a shadow on the snow. But Father says it's nothing to mind. Imaginings. Nothing real. Just spots in our eyes or something." Then Eric remembered all that Ivra had told him. She was half fairy. People could see her if they had looked hard enough. But they were not apt to believe their own eyes when they had looked. That was dreadful to her. She had not said so, but he had guessed it from her face when she told him. Well, well, now he understood. A little better. These were Earth children, with shadows in their eyes. Ivra could never be their playmate, but he could see her well enough because his eyes were clear, and presently he would run out to her and they would go home together. But just now it was jolly and cozy here in the barn, and these Earth children were good fun. He hoped she would wait for him, but if she did not, he would find his way alone easily enough. "You don't really believe in it, do you?" the red-headed girl was asking. "If you do, better not. Grown-ups will laugh at you." "Nora, your grandmother, won't laugh," said Eric. "She knows Ivra well enough, and Helma too." "Oh yes," said the jolliest boy, "but she is queer. We love her, and she's a fine grandmother, I can tell you, and she tells the best stories, but she's queer just the same, and she can't fool us." "Let's go in and get some cookies from her," said the other boy. "They must be done by now." So up they hopped, and without another look towards the shadow out on the snow by the white birch, jumped down the hole, and ran out of the barn into the kitchen. Nora was there knitting by a table, 2 big pans of cookies just out of the oven, cooling in front of her. How good they smelled! Eric had never tasted hot ginger cookies before, and when Nora gave him one, a big round one, all for his own, he almost danced with delight. He perched on the edge of the table and ate that one and many another before he was done. "This boy, Grandma," began the red-headed girl. "His name is Eric," interrupted Nora, handing him another cookie. "I know him very well." "Well, he saw it while we were looking out of the barn window, and he said it was real and his playmate, and he wanted to call it in to tell us stories." "Don't say it," said Nora. "Her name is Ivra, but of course you can't play with her. She isn't an Earth child. She's a fairy, so don't say anything about it to your father when he comes home tonight. It would make him cross." "But it doesn't make you cross," laughed the jolliest boy. "And so, won't you tell us some stories about it now? You know, the little house in the wood, the treeman, the forest children, Helma, Ivra, and all the rest of it." "Do tell us a story," begged the other two. So Nora put down her knitting, and taking the cat on her lap, a great sleepy white fellow who had been purring by the stove, she began to tell them stories. She told stories about Helma and Ivra, the wind creatures, the snow witches, and many more. The children listened eagerly, clapping their hands now and then, and at the end of every story asking for more. But Eric was lost in wonder. The children thought the stories were not true, just fairy stories told them by a grandmother, and Nora had evidently long ago given up expecting them to believe. Her black eyes twinkled knowingly when they met Eric's puzzled ones, and all the time Eric had only to turn his head to see Ivra walking out there alone around in the field, looking at the farmhouse, waiting for him. But gradually, as the stories went on, the little figure out there grew more and more to look like just a blue shadow on the snow, paler and paler. Finally, he had to strain his eyes to see it at all. Then he jumped down from the table and said he must go home. His heart was beating a little wildly, for he was afraid Ivra might fade away from him altogether. These red-headed children were fine playfellows. He liked them oh so much. He wished he could stay and play with them for a week. Yes, but he must go now. That blue shadow on the snow seemed lonely. "Take her some cookies," said Nora, filling his pockets. The children laughed at the top of their voices. "Yes, take some cookies." To the fairy, "But you can eat them yourself and pretend it is the fairy eating them," they cried. Nora laughed with them, and so after a minute Eric joined in, but he and Nora looked at each other through their laughter and nodded understanding. When Ivra saw him at last come out of the farmhouse door, she didn't wait longer, but ran away into the wood. He overtook her a long way in, walking rapidly. "Did you have a good time with the witches?" he asked. "Why didn't you come too?" she said. "Oh, it was too cold. Nora's grandchildren are awfully good fun. We played hide-and-go-seek, just as we played it at the Treeman's party. Did they laugh at me? No, they laughed at me. They thought I was a funny boy, to have me for a playmate. Then Eric began to think that Ivra was not very happy. Perhaps she had been lonely. "You're always running off with the Snow Witches," he said, "but I won't play with Nora's grandchildren any more unless they'll let you play too. I won't, truly." Ivra laughed, and it was like spring coming into winter. "Yes, play with them all you like. I love them too. I've often watched them. The littlest boy, the one with the funny curls, laughs at me and stares, but the other two, they just give me a glance and then forget all about me. They don't think I'm real, but they are awfully jolly. You play with them, and when you tell me about it, afterwards, I'll pretend I was there playing too." Then the two clasped hands and went skipping home. Chapter 14. Spring Comes. One morning, when Ivra woke up, she knew spring had come before her eyes were open, but Eric had to go outdoors to make sure. He was sure enough when he smelled the ground, a good earth smell. Snow still clung to the garden in spots here and there, but the warm sun promised it would not be for long. Something in the sky, something in the air, a smell of earth, and a stirring in his own heart told him it was true. Spring had come. Ivra had felt and known it before her eyes were open, and now that they were open, those eyes of hers looked like two blue spring flowers just awake. She hopped about in the garden, poking and prodding the earth with a stick, looking for her violets, her anemones, her star flowers. Not a green leaf was pushing through yet, but oh, how soon there would be. Suddenly she stopped and stood still, looking away into the forest. Then she ran to Eric on the door stone. She cried, "Mother will come now. Don't you feel it? She will come with the spring." Eric did feel it, for there was magic in the day. The magic came to him in the air, in the smell of the earth, in the new warm wind, and said, "Everything is yours that you want. Joy is coming," and Mother Helma was what he wanted, so he felt sure she was on the way. She must have found the key, or do you suppose she climbed the gray wall? Wondered Ivra. "Shall we go to meet her?" asked Eric. No, we must get the house clean and ready for her. We must hurry." And then such a house cleaning was begun as you or I have never seen. The forest children had been up at dawn to greet the spring, and now they came running to tell Ivra and Eric about it. When they heard that Helma was at last coming back and the house was to be cleaned, they wanted to help. First it was decided to wash the floor. Pail after pail of water from the fountain they splashed on it. Streamlets of water flowed into the fireplace and out over the door stone. Out and in ran the forest children, trying to help, and with every step making footprints on the wet floor, muddy little footprints, dozens of them, and finally hundreds of them. Then the windows were washed, and because the forest children could not run on those, they were made bright and clear, but soon the forest children pressed their faces against the panes to watch for Helma, and as the minutes passed, breath clouds formed there, spreading and deepening until the glass sparkled no more. But no one noticed, no one cared, for now they were shining up the dishes, polishing them with cloths, and setting them in neat rows in the cupboard. Then Wild Star appeared, his hands full of spring flowers that he had found deep in the forest, in the sunniest and most protected place, the very first spring flowers. Helma must have gotten past that wall now. It's spring, he said, and here are some flowers to greet her. See, I left the roots on, the way she likes them. Let's plant them by the door stone. They dug up the earth with their hands, forest children's hands, Wild Star's hands, Eric's and Ivra's, and planted the flowers all about the door stone. Then Wild Star flew away a little languidly. Ivra looked after him. He'll soon find the deepest, darkest, coolest place, she said, make himself a nest of smooth leaves, and dream away the summer. Fall and winter are his flying times. We shall see him at no more parties for a while. And the Snow Witches, what will become of them? Asked Eric. They will get into hollows of old trees and under rocks, draw in their skirts and their hair, curl up and sleep. Good news, thought Eric, but he did not say it, for he knew Ivra liked the Snow Witches almost best of all to play with, and would miss them. Now the tree girl came through the gap in the hedge. She was wearing a green frock, green sandals, and pussy willow buds made a wreath in her hair. Spring, spring, she cried as she came up the path. We heard the sap running in our tree all night. Father has gone on a spring wandering, and I shall stay within tree no longer for a while. We know, crowed Ivra. I knew before my eyes were opened this morning. Eric had to smell the ground first. Imagine. We have been cleaning house. Mother will surely come now. Don't you feel it? The tree girl lifted her face up in the new warm wind. Her soft hair floated feather-like. Yes, I feel it. She is on the way. Spring brings everything. A bird flashed from the trees. It lighted on the hedge for a second and was away again. But Eric had had time to recognize the beautiful bird he had seen caged in the witch's fur. The caged bird, he cried to Ivra. It is free. It is flying away. The bird fairies were flying away too. They were going to meet the birds coming up from the south and teach them their songs as they flew. They came to say goodbye to the children. Look for us next winter, they called back as they fluttered off in a silvery cloud. And finally, at high noon, just as Ivra had known she would since early morning, Helma came, running through the forest, jumping the hedge, and gathering Ivra and Eric into her arms. They three knelt on the ground by the spring flowers, embracing each other for a long, long minute. Did you find the key to the gate? Eric asked when his breath came back. Or did they let you come at last? I didn't have to find the key, and they didn't let me come. They would never have done that. But the minute I had on a light spring frock, I found I could climb the wall easily enough, and so I came running all the way. And now they shall never get me back behind doors again. I am free. I am as free as you, my children. She held them off and looked into their eyes. She was dressed in a brown silk gown, all torn and stained from her wall climbing and rush through the bushes. Her feet were bare, for she had kicked off her funny high-heeled city boots the minute she had reached the forest. Her hair had grown to her shoulders and looked more like flower petals than ever, but her face was not brown and serene as Eric had first seen it. It was pale and wild. "They don't believe in you children," she said. "They don't believe in me, not the me that I am. And from morning to night they made me a slave. They made me wear such ugly, hurting things, and then they made me dance. Every night we danced in hot rooms and ate strange, bad-tasting food. They called dancing like that a party. But I could only remember our forest parties, and our dancing here under the cool moon. The only glimpse of the forest I had was your snow witches, Ivra. Sometimes I saw them from my bedroom window, way out in the fields, whirling and scudding in mad games. And then, at last, one morning some wind creatures flew by above the garden wall. But when I called Wild Star back and tried to ask him about you children, as he perched on the wall, they came rushing into the garden and dragged me away. They said it was time for luncheon, and I must change my frock. But let us forget. I am here. It is spring." She jumped up and stood just as the tree girl had stood earlier that morning, her face lifted in the wind. Slowly that face grew calm, and warm color flooded it. "How nicely cleaned the house is!" she exclaimed, when at last they went in, for she did not see the tracks on the floor, nor the clouded windows. All she saw was that the children had worked there to make it fit for her homecoming. Ivra was proud and glad that she noticed. "I have made you a spring frock too," she said, bringing it out, "and Eric has made you some sandals. He makes fine sandals now." The frock was a brown smock with a narrow green belt. The sandals were well made and very soft and light. Helma stripped off the tattered silk frock, the funny thing with its long sleeves and stiff lace collar, and hid it away out of sight. On went the new smock, over her head in a twinkling. She stepped into the sandals, and there was their mother, the Helma Eric had first seen. "The garden now, we must see about that," she said in her old quiet way. Then they went out into the garden, and Helma began to plan just where there should plant seeds, and just what must be done. The children clung to her hands, looking up into her face, and would not let her take a step away from them. When she stood still, they leaned against her, one against either side, and wound their arms about her. In mid-afternoon, spring came, not the spring of the year, but spring himself, the person the season is named for. He was a tall young man, with a radiant face and fair curls lifting in a cloud from his head. When he walked, the earth sprang up in green grass after his bare feet, and flowers followed him like a procession. Helma ran to him, swifter than the children, and he kissed her lips. He lifted Ivra nigh on his shoulder for 1 minute, where she thought she looked away over the tree-tops, hundreds of miles to the blue ocean, but it may have been only his eyes, which were very blue, that she was looking into. With him came 2 earth giants. They were huge brown fellows, with rolling muscles and kind, sleepy eyes. They crouched down at the opening in the hedge, and waited for spring to go on with them. "Shall we plant the garden, Helma?" asked Spring. "Yes, yes," cried the children, and Helma said, "Yes, yes," as eagerly as they. So the earth giants came in and plowed it all up with their hands 20 times as large as an earth man's. When they were done, the garden was a rich golden color, and right for planting. Then Helma pointed out to Spring, where she wanted the seeds to be. Violets here, roses there, lilies there, pansies there, and daisies there. Spring gave some seeds to the children, and sowed some himself. Helma sat on the door-stone and joyously directed the work. By twilight the garden was done, and Spring went away with his earth giants. As he went out through the forest, flowers and green grass followed him, and the next morning even the dullest earth person would know that spring had come. As for Helma and Ivra and Eric, the house would not hold their joy, and so they dragged out their beds and slept that night in the new plowed, sweet-smelling garden. Chapter 15. Spring Wandering. "There goes another," said Helma as she stood in the door the very next morning after her return. "The littlest forest child that was, and all by himself. He seems rather small to go spring wandering alone." "He likes to go alone," Ivra answered. She was setting the table for breakfast, and Eric was helping her. Most always he's playing or wandering off by himself somewhere. Helma stood watching the little fellow until he had vanished amid the delicate green of the forest morning. Then she tossed back her hair with a shake of her head and cried gaily, "Let's go wandering ourselves, pets. It's good to be home, but we have all our lives for that now. Let's adventure." The children were overjoyed. They did not want to wait for breakfast, but Helma thought they had better, for no one knew where, when, or how their next meal would be. Of course, though, it was hard to eat. You know yourself how you feel about food when you are going on an adventure. However, the bowls of cereal were swallowed somehow. Then the stoutest sandals were strapped on, and the three were ready to set out. First they went to Nora's farm, and before they had waited many minutes in the shadow of the trees on the edge of the field, Nora came from the door, carrying their jug of milk. They ran to meet her and tell her not to leave any more milk until they should come back. How glad the old woman was to see Helma. "I thought Spring would bring you," she said. "Spring frees everything." Then Helma, Ivra, and Eric were off for their spring wandering. It seemed as though everyone else was wandering too, for they could hardly walk a mile without meeting some friend or stranger forest person. All gave them greeting, whether stranger or friend, and all looked very glad that Helma was in the forest again, for good news travels fast there, and even the strangers knew of her homecoming. In a secret wooded valley, walking softly to hear the birds and the thousand little other songs of earth, they suddenly came upon a strange and thrilling sight. A party of little girls and boys, all in bright-colored frocks, purple, orange, green, blue, yellow, were putting the finishing touches on an airboat they were making. It was built of delicate leaved branches and decorated with wild flowers. A great anchor of dog-tooth violets hung over the sides and kept it on the ground. When they saw Helma and the children coming so silently toward them, they jumped into the boat and crowded there, looking like a bunch of larger spring flowers. Then they drew in the anchor rapidly, but the little girl sitting high in the back, the one in the torn yellow dress and with blowing cloud-dark hair, cried, "Oh, no fear, it's Ivra and her mother and the clear-eyed earth child." "Want to come, Ivra? We're off spring wandering among the white clouds." Ivra shook her head and called, "Not unless 3 of us can come." "Too full for that," called down the yellow-frocked one, for now the boat had lifted softly almost to the tree-tops. "Your earth child would weigh us down, so hail and farewell. Good wandering." So the 3 on the ground stood looking up and waving and calling back, "Good wandering," until the green boat had drifted away, and was lost in the spring sky. But for a long time after, there floated down to them, in the valley, far laughter and glad cries. The spring nights were cold, and so at twilight they made themselves a shelter of boughs. They slept as soon as it was night, and woke and were off at the break of dawn. Helma carried sweet chocolate in her pockets, and forest friends and strangers offered them from their store all along the way. Sometimes, when they were tired or warm with walking, they would climb into the top of some tall tree, and there, swinging among the cool new leaves, Helma began telling them her world stories again, while the children looked off over the trembling forest roof and watched for homing birds. But when the hemlock and fir trees began to crowd out the maples and oaks, Helma said quietly one day, "We are nearing the sea." "The sea," cried Eric, almost wild with sudden delight. "Shall we see it? Shall we swim in it? Oh, I have never seen it." "Oh, I saw it from Spring's shoulder," Ivra cried. She really thought she had. "But mother, mother, what a wonderful surprise you had for us." They began to run in their eagerness, but Helma held them back. "It's a day's journey yet," she said, and so they walked as patiently as they could down a long, long slope through dark firs and hemlocks. It was noon of the following day when they finally came to the sea. They had struggled through a thick undergrowth of thorned bushes where the great arms of the firs shut out everything ahead. Then suddenly they were out of it, in the open on the shore with the waves almost lapping their toes. It was high tide. The blue sea stretched away to the blue sky. Eric's legs gave way under him, and he knelt on the white sand, just looking and looking at the bigness of it, the splendor of it, the color of it, and listening to the music of it. Ivra ran right out into the foam brought in by the breakers, up to her waist, where she splashed the water with her palms until her hair and face were drenched with salt spray. Helma stood looking away to foreign countries which she could almost see. But they were not left long to themselves. The heads of a little girl and boy and a young woman appeared over the crest of a great wave, and the 3 were swept up to the shore. They grabbed Ivra and drew her along with them as they passed, laughing musically. Ivra did not like it at first, and sprang away from them the minute she could shake herself free. But when she saw their merry faces and heard them laugh, she returned shyly. The children were about Eric's and Ivra's ages, and the young woman was their mother. The children's names were Non and Dan, and the woman's name was Sally. But though they had earth names, they were of the fairy kind, called, in the forest, blue water people. Just peer into a clear pool or stream almost any bright day, and you will be pretty sure to see one of them looking up at you. They are the sauciest and most mischievous of all fairies. Only stare at them a little, and they will mock you to your face with smiles and pouts, and will not go away as long as you stay, for they have no fear of you or any earth people. They follow their streams right into towns and cities, under bridges and over dams. You are as likely to find one in your city park as in the forest." Helma spoke to Sally, while the children eyed each other curiously. She said, "How happy you blue water people must be now spring has freed you at last." Sally dropped down on the beach, her dark hair flung like a shadow on the sand. Her laughing face looked straight up into the sky. She stretched her arms above her head. "He came just in time. Another day, and we would have had to break through the ice ourselves. Truly, we've never had such a long winter. Why, a month ago we began to look for spring. We lay with our faces pressed against the cold ice for hours at a time, watching. We could just see light through, and shadows now and then. And then I saw him first," cried Dan, who was listening to his mother. "No, I," cried Nan. "No, no," Sally laughed. "I heard him singing, a long way off, and I called you children away from your game of shells. When his foot touched the ice, we danced in circles of joy, and tapped messages through to him with our fingers. The ice vanished under his feet, and our stream rushed hither away to the sea. We came with it, and waved him hail and farewell as we poured down. Who can stop at home in springtime? And we had been ice-bound so long. And now we are here," boasted Dan. "I'm going to swim across the sea tomorrow, or the next day." "You're too little for that. Calm water is best, or little rushing streams," warned Sally. "What is it like across the sea?" asked Eric. "Another world." "I'll tell you about it in the next story," promised Helma. "And then, when I have told you, Eric, you may want to go across yourself and see the wonders." Eric drew a deep breath. "Yes, you and Ivra and I in a boat." He pointed to a white sail far out, stuck up like a feather slantwise in the water. Ivra clapped her hands, but Helma shook her head. "When you go, it must be alone. Ivra and I belong to the forest." "Why then, I don't want to go ever." Eric shook the thought from him like water. "Well, let's swim across now," Dan shouted, and ran into the waves, falling flat as soon as he was deep enough, and swimming fast away. The other children followed him, ready for a frolic. You or I would have found that water very cold, but these were hardy children, and one of them, all winter, had made comrades of the snow witches, remember? They waded out to the surf and plunged through it, head first. They took hands and floated in a circle beyond, rising and falling in the even motion of the rollers. Nan was very mischievous, and soon succeeded in pushing Eric out, under where the waves broke, when he looked up suddenly and saw the great watery roof hanging over him. He was terrified, but he did not scream. People who comraded with Ivra could not do that. He shut his eyes tight, and then thundering down came the water roof, and a second after, up bobbed Eric like a cork, choking and sputtering. They were laughing at him, even Ivra. The minute the salt water was out of his eyes, he laughed too, and tried to push Nan into the surf. but she was too quick for him and slipped away, farther out to sea. Then began a game of water tag. Eric, because he was not such a good swimmer as the others, was it most of the time, but Ivra had to take a few turns as well. It was impossible to catch the other two. They moved in the water as reflected light moves along a wall, not really swimming at all, but flashing from spot to spot. Helma and Sally lay on the sand in the spring sunshine and talked about their children. Nan and Dan tear their clothes so, sighed Sally. I could spend all my time mending. I must make little Eric some new clothes, said Helma. I hope I have cloth enough at home. Nan is naughty, but she is a darling, laughed Sally as Eric was pushed under the surf. Helma waited to see that he came up smiling, and then said, Ivra and Eric never quarrel. They play together from morn till night like two squirrels. They all had lunch together on the shore. The blue water children, instead of eating, smelled some spring flowers which Sally had found. That is the way they always take their nourishment. Helma turned some little cakes of chocolate out of her pockets, and though at first it seemed like a small luncheon, when it was all eaten they felt satisfied. All the afternoon the children played up and down the beach. They found a smooth, round, pink seashell, which they used for a ball. Eric was the best at throwing. It made him happy and proud to excel in something at last. He taught them how to play baseball, which he had once watched Miss Fregg's boys playing on Sundays in the backyard. They used a piece of driftwood for a bat, and when the shell got accidentally batted into the sea, the blue water children fielded it like fishes. When they were tired of ball, the blue water children drew lines on the sand for hopscotch, a game they had sometimes watched city children playing in a park, and taught Ivra and Eric about that. Then they built a castle of sand and walled it in with seashells. Helma showed them how to make the moat and the bridge, and Sally and she took turns and made up a story about the castle and told it to them. Towards evening, some earth people came by, near to the shore, in a little steam launch. There were men and women and several children in it. They crowded into the side of the boat towards the shore to stare curiously at Helma and Eric. They could not see the others, of course. Helma, with her free, bright hair and bare feet, looked very strange to them, and they could not understand what Eric was doing with his arms held straight out at each side. He was between Nan and Dan, holding their hands and standing to watch. But the earth people looked right through the blue water children, or thought they were shadows perhaps. One of the men put his hands to his mouth like a megaphone and called to Helma, asking her if she did not want to be picked up. They thought her being there in the wild place with a little boy alone and barefooted very singular. They thought she might have been shipwrecked, but Helma shook her head, and so they had to take their wonder away with them. The boat swept by. Ivra ran out into the waves, waist deep, to watch the strange thing. She had never seen a steam launch before, or anything like it. A baby, held in his nurse's arms, caught sight of her and waved tiny dimpled hands, calling and cooing. She saw his sparkling eyes, his light fuzzy hair, his little white dress and socks. She ran farther into the water, waving back to him and throwing him dozens of kisses, but no one else in the boat saw her, and after a minute the baby's attention turned to a seagull flying overhead. Ivra returned to shore, her face shining. There had been no doubt of it. The baby had seen her at once, and had had no doubts. He had laughed and reached his hands to her. The little fairy child almost hugged herself with delight. They built themselves shelters of driftwood. When night fell, Eric's was just large enough for him to crawl into and lie still. One whole side of it was open to the sea. Soft fur bows made his bed, and Helma had left a kiss with him, but he did not sleep for a long while. He lay on his side, looking out over the star-sprinkled water, and up at the star-flowering sky, and he could not have told how or from where the command had come, but he knew as he looked that he must cross that sea and go into the new world beyond it, and see all things for himself. World stories were good, but they were not enough. How he was to go, or how live when he got there, he did not once think of that, just that he was to go filled his whole mind. He forgot that he had said he would not go without Helma and Ivra. He did not think of them at all. He just lay still listening to the sea's command to go beyond and beyond. Chapter 16. Over the Tree Tops. He was waked by Ivra's joyous cries just at dawn, and rolled out of his shelter, rubbing his eyes and stretching his arms and legs. But as soon as his eyes were well open, he jumped up and uttered a cry of joy himself, for hanging just above the water on the edge of the sea was a great blue seashell airboat with blue sails, and the Tree Mother stood in it, talking to Helma and Ivra, who had run down to the water's edge. The boat and the sails were blue. Tree Mother's gown was blue. The sea and the sky were blue. Tiny white caps feathered the water. Tiny white clouds feathered the sky, and Tree Mother's hair was whiter and more feathery than either. Her eyes were dark like the treemen's, only keener and softer both, and in spite of her being a grandmother, her face was brown and golden like a young out-of-door girl's, and she was slim and quick, and more than beautiful. Eric stood beside Ivra, his face lifted up to the Tree Mother's, aglow and quivering. "She is going to take us home," Ivra said softly. Then Tree Mother turned the boat, and it drifted in and down on the sand. The children and Helma climbed in. The Tree Mother said very little on the long ride, but her presence was enough. The three were almost trembling for joy, for the Tree Mother's companionship is rare, and one of the splendidest things that can happen to a forest person. The minute they were in the boat, it shot up and away towards home. "Where are the Blue Water children?" Eric cried, suddenly remembering their playmates of yesterday. "Have you been playing with Blue Water children?" asked Tree Mother. "They are gypsy folk, and you never know where you will find them next. They are probably miles away by now." "Faster, faster, Tree Mother," begged Ivra, who was hanging over the side of the boat and losing herself in joy with the motion and height. "Faster," said Tree Mother. "Then take care, hold on." The boat shot forward with a sudden rush. The spring air changed from cool feathers to a sharp wing beating their faces. Eric and Ivra slipped to the floor and lay on their backs. They dared not sit up for fear of being swept overboard. They could see nothing but the sky from where they lay, but they loved the speed and clapped their hands, and Ivra cried, "Faster, faster!" The Tree Mother laughed. "These are brave children," she thought. "Shut your eyes then," she said, "and don't try too hard to breathe." They swept on more swiftly than a wild goose, so swiftly that soon the children could neither hear, speak, nor see, and then at last they were traveling so fast that it felt as though the boat were standing perfectly still in a cold, dark place. Gradually light began to leak through their shut eyelids. The wing of the wind beat away from them, and the boat rocked slower and slower in warm, spring-scented air. But in that brief time they had traveled many, many miles. Now, when the children leaned over the side, they saw that they were sailing slowly over their own forest. The treetops were like a restless green sea just a little beneath them. They flew low enough to hear bird calls and the voices of the streams. It was then they suddenly noticed that the littlest of the forest children was there curled up fast asleep at Tree Mother's feet. Ivra cried to him in surprise, and he woke slowly, stretching his little brown legs, shaking his curly head, and lifting a sleepy face. He was puzzled at seeing others beside Tree Mother in the boat. He had been riding and awake with her all night up near the stars, and had dropped to sleep as the stars faded. She bent now and took his hand. "I picked these wanderers up at dawn," she said, "and now we are all going back together. We are well on the way." They had left the forest roof and were sailing over open country. "A shortcut," Tree Mother explained. "Oh, look!" cried Ivra excitedly, almost tumbling over the edge in her endeavor to see better. "Isn't that the gray wall off there?" Yes, it was the gray wall that had prisoned their mother all winter. The boat went slower and slower as they neared it, and then almost hung still over the garden. The garden was full of people, having some kind of a party, for many little tables were set there with silver and glass that shone brilliantly in the sun. Servants were hurrying back and forth, carrying trays, and their gilt buttons sparkled almost as much as the silver. But how strange were the people! Eric and Ivra and the littlest forest child laughed aloud. They were standing about so straight and stiff, holding their cups and saucers, and their voices rising up to the airboat in confusion sounded like 100 parrots. "Why don't they sit down on the grass to eat?" wondered the littlest forest child. "And why don't they wash their feet in the fountain? They look so very hot and walk as though it hurt." "Sitting on the grass and washing their feet in the fountain is against the law there," Helma said. But neither Ivra nor the littlest forest child knew what against the law meant. Eric knew, however, for he had lived 9 years, remember, where most everything a little boy wanted was against the law. "But why did they stay?" asked Eric. Helma looked a little grave. "Why did you stay, dear, for 9 long years?" He thought a minute. "I hadn't seen the magic beckoning," he answered then. "Neither have they," she said, "and perhaps never will, for their eyes are getting dimmer all the time." "But how can they help seeing it?" cried the littlest forest child. "See, all around the garden. It was true. All around the garden the tall trees stood and beckoned with their high fingers, beckoned away and away with promise of magic beyond magic. But the people in the garden never lifted their eyes to see it. They were looking intently into their teacups, as though it might be there magic was waiting. "They are prisoners," said Tree Mother, "just as you were, Helma, with this one difference. You were locked in, but they have locked themselves in, and carry their keys like precious things next their hearts." Helma sighed and laughed at once. Then she leaned far out and tossed a daffodil she was carrying down on the heads in the garden, shaking her short flower-petal hair as she did it. She had cut it before starting on the adventure, in a free, glad way. No one looked up to see where the flower had dropped from. The people down there were not interested in offerings from the heavens. So the boat sailed on. Away and away over the canning factory they drifted, where the little girl looked out from her window and up and waved her hands. "What are you waving at, like that?" a man asked, who was working near. "Oh, just a white summer cloud," she said, for she knew very well he did not want the truth. "And I might as well tell you here that that pale little girl was a prisoner who had not turned the lock herself, and did not carry the key next her heart. Others had done that before she was born, and she had seen the beckoning in spite of the lock, and now was only waiting a little while to answer it." The children were glad to find the forest roof beneath them again. It was noon when they sank down in the garden at their own white door-stone. Tree Mother left them there and flew away with the littlest forest child, the one who liked to wander alone by himself. Nora was in the house when they ran in. She had cleaned it with a different cleaning from what it had had for Helma's first return. There were no little footprints on the floor now, and the window panes shone like clear pools in sunlight. 3 dishes of early strawberries and 3 deep bowls of cream were standing on the table before the open door, and then, besides, there was a big loaf of golden brown bread. "I thought you would be hungry," said Nora, pointing to the feast. They were hungry indeed, for they had had nothing at all to eat since yesterday's lunch of chocolate. They very soon finished the strawberries and cream, and a jug of milk besides. "You are a good neighbor, Nora," Helma said gratefully. All Nora wanted in return for her labor and kindness was the story of their adventure. She listened eagerly to every word. "I shall tell this to my grandchildren," she said when the story was done, "and they will think it just a fairy tale. They'll never believe it's fairy truth. Oh, if they would only stop pretending to be so wise, they themselves might sometime get the chance of a ride over the tree-tops with Tree Mother. But they never will. Come play with them again sometime, Eric. They often talk about you. I'll come today, and bring Ivra if they'll play with her too." But Nora shook her head as she went away. "They don't believe in Ivra. How could they play with her? Their grandmother can teach them nothing, but they'll like the story of this adventure none the less for not believing it." When she was gone, the 3 took the dishes into the house and washed them. Then they went out and worked in the garden until dusk.